If you're debating whether to traditionally or self-publish your book, today I am going to share the top 5 factors you should consider and the pros and cons of each approach. And if this is your first time meeting me, hi, I'm Lauren. I am a young adult author and mom based in Brooklyn, and my debut novel, We Ship It, came out this past June with HarperCollins. And I absolutely love sharing advice and free resources with writers to make publishing accessible to all. Now, the debate behind whether traditional or self-publishing is better is a very controversial one, so I want to share 3 important prefaces before I go into the top 5 factors you should consider. The first one is that I have traditionally published 1 book and I haven't self-published any. So of course, I am not the foremost expert of this arena, but I've done a lot of research. I've looked at facts and figures and determined where that data came from and how trustworthy it is. And I get this question a lot from writers about whether traditional or self-publishing is the best path to take. So I just want to provide as much information as I have to help you make a more informed decision. But going on to preface number 2, I definitely can't make this decision for you. So definitely do additional research. And this comes down to what your true goals are as a writer. So be really honest with yourself. If your goal is that you just want to see your story on paper and have it available for friends and family to buy, that is very different from if your goal is to sell as many books as possible and try to quit your job and pursue writing full time. So really sit down and ask yourself, what is the real reason you're writing and what is your ultimate goal? And the third preface that is really important to consider is that we are bombarded with success stories from social media and the news, and these are outliers. So, a lot of times I'll hear, oh, these self-published authors, they all just promote their books on social media and become millionaires. And yes, some people do, but they are 1 in maybe 10 or 100,000 or 1 in a million. So I don't want you basing your decision on outliers. I want you to look at the average, and not even just the average because the outliers can really skew that data, but look at the median, look at, the 90% and try not to base your decision on the top 10% or the top 1%, although I do hope that you end up in that. And along those lines, I think that traditional versus self-publishing can be like a David versus Goliath, and traditional publishing is the Goliath, right? And we really want David to win and to root for people whose books got rejected by agents and traditional publishers and went on to earn millions of dollars. I really love those stories and they are great, but once again, they are the outliers and they are rare. So don't view traditional publishing as like the big bad guy who does nothing for authors. They do a good amount, and at the same time, don't view traditional publishing as this like end-all, be-all, like the only path for your book. And if you get a deal, your life is going to be perfect forever and you're going to be a famous author, because I can tell you that is not the case for many of us. All right, so with all of that said, let me go into my top 5 factors to consider. So the first factor is gatekeeping. I talk about gatekeeping a lot, but this is a very, very gatekept industry. And one of the biggest cons to traditional publishing is that only around 1% of authors who try to get traditional publishing deals actually do. And that is really sad and disheartening because it's not that only 1% of books deserve to be read. I would say most stories deserve to be read. They might not all be at the right level yet, but definitely more than 1% of stories are at that level and are amazing books and are polished and ready to go. And an agent might not realize that, and you could still have a really, really great story. Now, I do think that the bar is really high for traditional publishing, and I often advise authors to at least try to shoot for that first if their goal is to sell as many books as possible and make as much money as possible, which I will get to. But at least try, because that really pushes you to get your book to the highest possible level, which you very much also want it at if you're going to self-publish, because then it's also you in charge of marketing that book, so you need it to be as good as it can be. But back to gatekeeping, let's say around 1% of books actually get traditionally published. Are those the very top 1%? Some probably are, and some probably aren't. And there are probably some books in that 1% that don't gain representation. And this matters most when it comes to people from historically marginalized groups, because a lot of the decision makers involved in traditional publishing are not very diverse. So that is one of the top reasons that I really love self-publishing, because it just knocks down those gates and makes publishing your book accessible to really anyone. So the second factor that I want to discuss is speed. I am a very impulsive, impatient person. I put in a lot of work and I want immediate results. And let me tell you, that does not happen with traditional publishing. I started writing in 2017, I got my book deal in 2021, and my book came out this year in 2023, so that is 6 years. And the wild part of that is considered fast in the world of traditional publishing. So aside from the fact that that is just a really long time to have to sit around and wait, it also affects your career. I think back and think, if my book had been able to come out immediately, how much more could I have done and learned and iterated and grown as a writer from getting my book out there, getting responses from readers, and then continuing to write future books. So speed is a very important factor to consider, because if you self-publish, you can have your book online with KDP almost instantly. And with traditional publishing, I had to wait 2 years for my book deal. For some adult books, it's maybe about a year, but it's a really, really long time from the book deal, and it's also a long time to getting that deal. So for me, it was 6 years, once again, considered fast. All right, the third factor that I want you to consider is control and work involved, because they go hand in hand. So with self-publishing, you get a ton of control. You get to decide exactly what's included in your story, what edits are made, what the cover looks like, how it's marketed, all of that. Amazing if you love to have complete control. On the other side of that is there is a ton of work involved. You have to go out and look at cover designers and find one to hire and tell them exactly what you want. You have to go out and often find your own editor. Then you have to market your book. And let's not underestimate the amount of time and effort that goes into marketing a book that actually sells. So just in my case, for instance, I spent about 3 months full-time creating content on TikTok, and I grew from 0 to 10,000 followers. And even then, for the pre-orders of my book, it was like under 200. And a bunch of caveats there, because my book is a young adult contemporary book, and another huge factor to consider with self-publishing are that genres like romance, crime, and sci-fi/fantasy tend to do a lot better. And I think also just adult genres in general. So I think it would be a lot harder to self-publish a young adult book. Definitely possible, but harder. And similarly, I think it's harder in general to market a young adult book, or a lot harder to market that on TikTok as opposed to marketing, for instance, a romance book. But all that said, I had done a bunch of marketing in my past. I spent a ton of time. I grew pretty fast, and it still didn't lead to that many sales. And now I was traditionally published, so I'll get into that because that helped me get book sales. But I don't think a lot of people realize how hard marketing is. Like, even getting 5 or 10 people a month to buy your book, for any self-published author out there, you know how hard of a task that can be. So you get the control with self-publishing, but you also get a lot of really hard work to getting your book out into the world and into readers' hands. All right, next up, let's talk money. So 2 sides to this. I want to talk about revenue, the money that you bring in from your book sales, as well as expenses, so the amount of money you spend on producing your book or marketing it and getting it out there. So with traditional publishing, you are pretty much always getting a book advance. And that money is going to you regardless of whether your book doesn't sell any copies. It goes to you in advance, that's why it's called an advance. And it's generally split up, like you might get a third on signing and a third when you turn in the final draft and a third when the book comes out. That's how mine worked. But you get that, even if your book does not sell very well. And this is hugely important to consider. One stat I read said that 80% of books don't out-earn their advance. So that means publishing companies are losing money on your book and you are sort of making more than you deserve. And that is huge, because if you just made the money off of royalties that the publishing house made, you'd be probably worse off than self-publishing. But because you have this guarantee, that takes away a lot of risk. And so if you are a writer that really needs a more stable line of income, traditional publishing, once again, not a guarantee, but it is nice to have that guaranteed sum. And I've seen that the median for book advances is around $25,000, which is not a full-time salary, but definitely not a small amount. And then the average, which is even higher because the outliers then come into play, I think can be 50 or 60 something thousand. So that's a good amount of money. And then in terms of when the book is sold, you only get more money if your book out-earns the advance. So we're gonna need a much longer video on the math behind that. But after your book has out-earned, you're getting, it could be like 5 to 20%, I think usually 10 to 15% of the royalties from that book. Now let's talk about self-publishing. So I think a lot of people love that with self-publishing, you can get up to 70% of royalties from your book. And right, we like that we're getting the lion's share of the profit of the work that we've put in. But here's the thing. Would you rather have 70% of a small amount or 10% of a really large amount? It's not like a guarantee that that's going to be the case, but when it comes to royalties, don't just think about the percent. You have to think about the bigger picture. So the amount of money you make has to do with the percentage of royalties you get, the number of copies that you sell, as well as the price of your book. So you are getting a higher percentage from a self-published book, but on average, that is selling for a lower amount than a traditionally published book. And then in terms of number of copies sold, I will get there in a second because that's my fifth point. Now let's talk about expenses, because this is huge. A lot of people really don't have the money to invest unless they are going to get that money back. And so one thing that's really hard with self-publishing that I don't think enough people talk about is that if you are putting it out there and you're not going the traditional publishing route, you generally want to have your book edited. And so for a lot of people, that's getting a developmental big picture edit, as well as line edits and often a proofreader. That can really add up to a few $1,000s. Then you add in cover design, maybe some marketing expenses, maybe the software you're using. It's a good amount of money, and around 90% of self-published books sell under 100 copies in their first year, so they are definitely not making that money back. And now that's okay if going in, you know that and expect that, and your goal isn't to just make a huge profit. But if you are looking to make a huge profit or you want some guarantee that you're going to get your money back, that is not the case with self-publishing. On the other hand, it has become more and more common for traditionally published authors to also pay for developmental editors before they pitch their book to agents. I did this. My editor was hugely, hugely helpful. I think it's a huge reason that I got 8 agent offers and a big book deal. And so I put that money in, also not knowing if I would get it back. But then I got it back like 20, 30x in the book advance I got. So that was a huge pro for me with traditional publishing, but once again, was not a guarantee. Also, once again, what I am talking about does not apply to everyone. I know some people are going to say, I didn't work with an editor and I self-published, or I didn't spend any money, or I only spent a few $100s. That is all possible. But if you want to be someone who has the highest probability of getting your book into as many readers' hands as possible and earning as much money as possible, it often makes sense to at least have some editing done, and that definitely is an investment. And finally, let's talk about the number of books sold. So I have seen stats that on average, a self-published book sells around 250 copies, and on average, a traditionally published book sells around 3,000 copies. And when it comes into the work involved in getting your book out there, as I said, it's a ton of work. And with traditional publishing, I've heard a lot of people who are like, oh, I thought my publisher would do so much more, and it's like they did nothing. But even if it seems like your publisher does nothing, they have this huge network that they have spent decades building up of book distributors around the country and around the world. And so for me, for instance, I was just a nobody debut young adult author, and my book was available in major airports around the United States. Like, that's huge. Tons of books were sold just because it was at those airports. I never could have had that partnership if I had self-published my book. So There's a lot that goes on behind the scenes, and that's just woven into the foundation of a traditional publisher, which is why you're getting that low royalty rate. And also because they're taking that big risk on you and they lose money on a ton of books. So that's another reason you get that low rate. At the end of the day, you are more likely, not a guarantee, outliers, etc., but more likely to sell more books and make more money as a traditionally published author. But also, things are changing. I saw a stat that self-published authors made 50% more money in 2022 than 2021. And I love this. I love how accessible self-publishing is. I love how much people can spread the word about their books on social media. And even though I'm still a fan of traditional publishing, I would love for both to be equally wonderful paths for authors to take. At the end of the day, once again, it goes back to what your goals are as a writer. So my top advice to writers who want to sell as many books as possible and make as much money as they possibly can, first of all, go in with low expectations. That's going to help. Don't expect to be an outlier. And then second, get your book as good as it can be. Maybe try pitching it to agents. If you don't have success there, definitely consider self-publishing it. Don't just leave your book lying on a shelf forever. Your story is really important, and I want you to get it out into the world.